Most people have never been inside their own home for 24 hours without electricity. Not really. Not the kind of without electricity that means no backup, no generator humming in the garage, no quick run to a hotel 3 miles away. The kind that means darkness falls at sundown and stays there. The kind that means the refrigerator has been silent long enough that you can hear the difference. The kind where you walk into a room expecting a light to come on and it doesn't. And that small moment, that tiny failure of expectation, tells you more about how unprepared you are than any checklist ever could. 24 hours. That is the number most people assume is the edge of discomfort before things get serious. Most families think of it as a long inconvenience, a nuisance with a defined end. And that assumption is exactly what makes the 24-hour mark so dangerous. Because by the time 24 hours have passed, your home has already changed in ways most people never see coming. The food in your refrigerator has entered a countdown you cannot reverse. The water pressure in your pipes may have already begun to drop. The medications that require refrigeration are approaching the limit of what the manufacturer will guarantee. The carbon monoxide risk in your home has quietly increased if anyone lit a candle in an enclosed space or ran a generator too close to a window. And the most important resource you have, the ability to think clearly and make good decisions, has been slowly eroded by disrupted sleep, rising stress, and the creeping awareness that you have no plan. This is not a video about worst-case scenarios. This is a video about the 24 hours that most preparedness content skips over because it is not dramatic enough to sell survival gear and not boring enough to be ignored. It is the most realistic window of time in which most American families will ever experience a serious power outage. And it is the window in which the difference between a prepared household and an unprepared one becomes impossible to ignore. What you are about to hear is what actually happens inside a home, hour by hour, when the power goes out and does not come back. Not what people imagine happens. Not what movies suggest. What the data, the historical record, and the documented aftermath of real events tell us actually unfolds in the average American home when the lights go dark and stay dark for a full day. The first thing most people get wrong is the opening hour. When the power goes out, the instinct is almost universal. You wait. You pull out your phone. You check the utility company's outage map. You scroll for news, and you tell yourself it will be back within the hour. Statistically, that assumption has been accurate most of the time throughout your life. In a normal year, the average American experiences about 8 hours of total power interruption spread across multiple short outages. That history trains you to expect a quick resolution. It trains your nervous system to interpret a blackout as temporary. And for the first 60 minutes, that expectation is not irrational, but it is also when the most costly decisions get made. In the opening hour of a blackout, most families open the refrigerator 5 to 8 times. This is not an exaggeration. This is a behavioral pattern documented after major outage events and studied by utility companies and food safety researchers alike. People open the refrigerator to check what's inside, to grab a drink, to assess what might need to be eaten soon, to show the kids what's in there, and then again 10 minutes later out of pure habit. Each opening releases cold air that the refrigerator cannot replace. A well-stocked, properly sealed refrigerator will hold food at a safe temperature for approximately 4 hours after power loss, but only if the door stays closed. Every unnecessary opening shortens that window. Most families do not know this, and most families burn through a significant portion of that buffer in the first 60 minutes simply because they are not thinking about cold air as a finite resource yet. The refrigerator question matters more than most people realize, and not just because of food safety. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, the largest in North American history, affecting roughly 55 million people across 8 states and parts of Canada, health officials in New York and other affected areas documented a significant spike in gastrointestinal illness in the days following the outage. Some of this was attributed to contaminated water, But a meaningful portion was traced to food that had been consumed after sitting in refrigerators and freezers that had been opened too frequently during the outage. People trusted their refrigerators longer than they should have. They served meals with ingredients that had crossed into the temperature danger zone, the range between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, where bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli double in population roughly every 20 minutes. They could not see the bacteria. The food smelled fine. And then, days later, they were sick in the middle of an already difficult situation. The USDA's guidance on this is unambiguous and it has not changed. If you do not have a thermometer inside your refrigerator, you have no reliable way to know whether your food is safe. You cannot smell the danger zone. You cannot see it. You can only measure it. And most American families do not own an appliance thermometer. This is one of the quietest and most consequential gaps in household preparedness, because it costs approximately $10 to close it completely. And yet it remains one of the most consistently missing items in homes that experience multi-hour outages. By the second hour of a blackout, the emotional atmosphere inside a home begins to shift. The novelty wears off. Children who found the candles exciting in hour 1 are bored by hour 2. Adults who were calmly checking the utility map are now refreshing it more anxiously. The phones are still charged, but the awareness that they will not stay that way is beginning to surface. And this is the moment when the second major mistake happens. People start making plans based on how they feel rather than what they know. The most common version of this mistake is the generator decision. In a typical blackout, the number of generator-related carbon monoxide incidents spikes dramatically in the first few hours because people who own generators, and many who do not, but who borrow them or pull old ones out of storage, make impulsive decisions about placement. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has tracked this pattern for years. Carbon monoxide poisoning from generators is one of the leading causes of non-natural disaster-related deaths during power outages in the United States. In the hours following Hurricane Ida in 2021, at least 8 people died from carbon monoxide poisoning related to generators and other fuel-burning equipment used indoors or in attached garages. These were not reckless people. They were people making fast decisions under stress, and the consequences were permanent. What makes carbon monoxide particularly dangerous in a blackout context is that it is invisible and odorless, and the symptoms, headache, dizziness, nausea, are easy to mistake for stress, dehydration, or exhaustion, all of which are also present during a blackout. People have literally fallen asleep from carbon monoxide exposure during blackouts and not woken up because the symptoms blended with the fatigue of a stressful night. A working battery-powered carbon monoxide detector is not a luxury item. It is, by any reasonable definition, a life safety device. And it stops working if its batteries are dead or if it has not been tested in the last 6 months. Hour 3 and 4 are when the home's temperature situation becomes a real variable, and it becomes one much faster than most people expect. A well-insulated house will begin losing heat at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 degrees per hour in cold weather, depending on outdoor temperature, insulation quality, and how well doors and windows are sealed. That sounds gradual. But across a 24-hour period, it means a home that was 68 degrees when the power went out could be 45 degrees or lower by the following morning if temperatures outside are near freezing. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is what happened to hundreds of thousands of homes in Texas during the February 2021 winter storm event, known as Uri. During Uri, the ERCOT grid failure left approximately 4.5 million households without power, some for more than 4 days, during temperatures that reached single digits in parts of the state. Texas homes were not built for sustained cold. They lacked the insulation and pipe protection standards common in northern states, and the result was catastrophic. At least 246 people died in Texas during and after the storm, with hypothermia and other cold-related causes among the leading factors. Pipes burst across the state in staggering numbers, But a significant and often overlooked detail in the aftermath reporting is this. Many of the people who suffered most were not in the most extreme conditions. They were in homes that were cold enough to be dangerous, but warm enough to seem manageable. They did not recognize that their core body temperature was being gradually compromised because the ambient temperature in their home was dropping slowly, not suddenly. The danger was incremental. And incremental danger is the kind humans are worst at perceiving. The implications for a prepared household are specific. In winter conditions, the single most valuable thing you can do before hour 4 of a blackout is consolidate your family into one room and seal it as well as you can. A smaller space holds body heat far more effectively than a whole house. Close doors, hang blankets over doorways, and put everyone in layers before anyone is actually cold. Waiting until you are cold to get warm is already a losing position. This is counterintuitive but documented.
Then explain it.
Thermal regulation is far more efficient as a preventive measure than as a corrective one. If you have a wood-burning fireplace and it is functional, this is the hour to use it. If you do not, this is the hour to understand why a properly rated indoor safe emergency heater, not a propane grill, not a gas range, is a legitimate investment, not an overreaction. By hours 5 and 6, a different problem begins to compound everything else. Water. Most people do not connect water pressure to electricity, but the link is real and it becomes relevant fast. Municipal water systems in the United States rely on electrically powered pumps to maintain pressure throughout the distribution network. Many cities have enough reserve pressure in elevated storage tanks to maintain flow for several hours during a power outage. But in areas where the outage is widespread, affecting the pumping stations themselves, water pressure can begin to drop significantly within the first several hours. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, officials in several affected cities issued boil water advisories because the disruption to pumping systems created conditions where contaminants could potentially enter the water supply through pressure drops and pipe integrity issues. What this means practically is something most families never anticipate. The tap water you assumed would be available throughout a blackout may not be available, or may not be safe to drink by the time you reach hour 6. And if you have not stored any water before the outage began, your options narrow quickly. The EPA recommends 1 gallon of water per person per day as a minimum for drinking and sanitation. A family of 4 needs 4 gallons a day at absolute minimum, and more realistically 6 to 8 when you account for cooking, basic hygiene, and the additional hydration needs that come with physical or psychological stress. Most families have stored exactly 0 gallons of water specifically for emergency use. They assume the tap will work, and most of the time, they are right. But the moments when they are wrong tend to be the moments when everything else is also wrong. The water problem intersects with another issue that arrives quietly in hours 6 through 8. Medication. This one is particularly significant for the 42% of American adults who take at least one prescription medication regularly, and for the roughly 3% of the population who depend on medications that require refrigeration. Insulin being the most prominent example, but also certain biologics, some liquid antibiotics, and specific formulations used in cancer care and autoimmune treatment. Room temperature storage limits vary by medication, and many people do not know what the limit is for their specific drug. Insulin, for example, can generally be stored at room temperature for 28 to 30 days in an unopened vial. But once a home's temperature begins dropping below 50 degrees or rising above 80, that calculus changes. And in summer blackouts in the South or Southwest, home temperatures can exceed 80 degrees within hours when air conditioning fails. The broader medication issued during extended blackouts is not just about refrigeration, it is about access. Pharmacies depend on power to operate their point-of-sale systems, to process insurance, and to maintain the electronic records that govern controlled substance dispensing. During a widespread blackout, pharmacies close, and a patient who is 3 days away from running out of a critical maintenance medication, blood pressure medication, seizure medication, psychiatric medication, has no reliable way to refill it. This is a scenario that plays out every time a major blackout event strikes a populated area, and it consistently catches people off guard because it does not feel like a preparedness problem. It feels like a healthcare system problem, but the only person who can solve it before it becomes a crisis is the person taking the medication, and the window to solve it is before the power goes out. Hours 8 through 12 represent the psychological midpoint of the 24-hour window, and they are, in many ways, the hardest. The crisis is no longer novel. The initial adrenaline has worn off. The phones, which were at full charge when the outage began, are now at 30 or 40% for most people. Lower if they have been using them heavily to search for information or to contact family members. The darkness that felt manageable for a few hours feels heavier after most of a day. Sleep becomes difficult, particularly for children, for elderly family members, and for anyone with anxiety. And the absence of the ambient noise that most modern homes produce constantly, the refrigerator hum, the HVAC fan, the standby sounds of electronics, creates a silence that many people find surprisingly disorienting. This is the phase where decision-making quality drops most noticeably. Research on sleep deprivation and stress consistently shows that humans make worse risk assessments, worse resource allocation decisions, and worse interpersonal choices when they are tired and anxious simultaneously. In a blackout context, this translates to things like eating food that should have been discarded because wasting it feels wrong, using candles unsafely because the comfortable option feels more urgent than the safe one, or driving to check on a family member or find a store without fully thinking through road conditions, traffic signal outages, or fuel availability. Traffic signals going dark during a widespread outage create a genuine public safety hazard that consistently causes accidents. In the immediate aftermath of the 2003 Northeast blackout, traffic accident rates in affected urban areas increased significantly in the first several hours before law enforcement could be deployed to major intersections. Four-way stops are the legal default when signals are out, but many drivers either do not know this rule or choose not to follow it under stress. If you need to drive during a blackout, the calculus is not just about whether your car has fuel. It is about whether the roads are safe. By hour 12, the food situation has reached a clear decision point. Anything in the refrigerator that has been above 40 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 hours is, according to USDA food safety guidelines, in the discard category. This is a hard rule that produces genuine distress for most families, because it means throwing away food that looks and smells perfectly fine. The visual and olfactory signals that humans use to assess food safety are almost entirely useless against the specific bacterial threats that arise in the temperature danger zone. Food that has been at 60 degrees for 4 hours can harbor dangerous levels of staphylococcal bacteria that produce toxins heat cannot destroy. You cannot cook your way out of this problem. You cannot smell your way out of it. The only reliable tool is temperature tracking. And the only way to track temperature is with a thermometer you placed in the refrigerator before the outage. The freezer, by contrast, is a different story. And understanding the distinction matters. A full freezer will maintain a safe temperature for approximately 48 hours after power loss, assuming the door remains closed. A half-full freezer will maintain safe temperatures for roughly 24 hours. This is why a freezer that is packed tightly with food, or with frozen water bottles used as thermal mass, is meaningfully safer during an outage than a freezer that is half empty. The thermal mass of the frozen items is doing the work that the compressor can no longer do. If you open the freezer to check on things, you are accelerating the thaw. If you can resist opening it, you are banking time that will matter later. Hours 12 through 16 bring the most underappreciated hazard of a prolonged home blackout. Fire. The risk escalates for several compounding reasons. Candle use increases as darkness sets in for a second time, and the household's supply of working flashlights, which were inadequate to begin with for most families, begins to run low, or batteries start dying. People place candles in locations that felt safe when they were paying attention, then get drowsy and stop paying attention. Curtains, paper, fabric. Residential fire investigations consistently show that candle-related fires often start with a small piece of material that was too close to a flame that had been burning for hours with nobody watching. The National Fire Protection Association's data is consistent on this point. December and the winter holiday season, when candle use peaks, is also when candle-related home fire deaths peak. But the same pattern, extended candle use in tired households, appears in the aftermath of every major long-duration blackout. During the extended power outages following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, which left some areas without power for nearly a year, candle-related fires were among the documented causes of residential structure fires in communities that had no other light source. The connection between darkness, improvised lighting, and fire risk is not speculative. It is one of the most consistent findings in post-disaster residential safety analysis. A battery-powered lantern, or a set of LED lanterns with fresh batteries, eliminates this risk almost entirely. They do not flicker in drafts. They do not tip over and ignite. They can be left on safely in a room where children are sleeping. They cost $15 to $30 and last for hours on a single set of batteries. This is arguably the single most valuable piece of emergency equipment a family can own for a multi-hour blackout. And it is among the most commonly missing. Not because people cannot afford it, but because it is never urgent to buy until the moment it is. The psychological weight of the overnight hours, roughly 16 through 24, is something that changes families in ways they do not always articulate afterward, but that emergency psychologists have documented extensively. Disrupted sleep in a cold or uncomfortably warm home, with no reliable information about when power will be restored, with children who are anxious, with dwindling phone battery, and with the awareness that normal life is suspended for an undefined period. This combination produces a stress response that is physiologically similar to what researchers call acute situational anxiety. It is not pathological. It is a normal response to abnormal conditions, but it drains cognitive resources faster than people expect, and it makes the next morning, the 24-hour mark, harder than the night before felt. This is the detail that almost nobody mentions in preparedness content. The morning after is often the hardest moment of a short blackout, not the night of. The night carries its own adrenaline, its own problem-solving energy, its own sense of managing a situation. The morning brings the accumulated fatigue of disrupted sleep, the full reality of what is not working, the children who are hungry and have run out of patience, and, most significantly, the recognition that restoration is not guaranteed to come on any particular schedule. Many families, who managed the first 12 hours with reasonable calm, begin to fracture around the 20 to 24-hour mark, not because anything dramatically new has gone wrong, but because the cumulative weight of everything that has quietly degraded has become impossible to ignore. This is the moment when the presence or absence of a written emergency plan becomes most visible. Not a mental plan. Not a, we should probably figure out conversation that happened once. A written plan, physically on paper because phones may be dead, that answers the specific questions that arise in this window. Where is the nearest shelter or warming center? Who do we call first, and what is their number written down without a phone? What is our protocol if one of us needs medical attention and the car is low on gas? What is our food priority order for the next 24 hours, and what is still safe to eat? Which neighbors do we have an agreement with to check on each other? FEMA's research on community resilience consistently finds that households with written emergency plans fare better across every measurable dimension during and after disasters. Not because the plan is always followed exactly, but because the act of creating it forces the family to have conversations and make decisions before the pressure arrives. The plan is not the point. The conversations that produce the plan are the point. And those conversations cannot happen in the dark, with tired children, and depleted phones, and a refrigerator full of food that may or may not still be safe. By the time 24 hours have passed, your home is measurably different from the home it was before the power went out. The food landscape has changed in ways that may not be fully visible, but that are real and documented. The emotional reserves of every person inside have been drawn down. The temperature, in winter or summer, has moved in a direction that requires management. The water situation has become at least a question, if not an active problem. The fire risk has been navigated, successfully or not. The communication picture, how much battery, what information, who has been reached, is clearer or more worrying than it was. And the decision about what comes next, wait longer, go somewhere else, seek help, use remaining resources, has to be made with all of that context, and with whatever cognitive resources remain after a night of disrupted sleep in a difficult environment. None of this is impossible to manage. None of it is catastrophic if you see it coming. The families who navigate 24-hour blackouts with the least damage, physical, financial, emotional, are not the families with the most expensive equipment or the largest stockpiles. They are the families who thought through these specific failure modes before they arrived. They are the families who put a thermometer in the refrigerator on a regular Tuesday, not in a crisis. They are the families who bought LED lanterns and kept the batteries fresh, not because they were panicking, but because it was a $10 decision that closed a serious risk. They are the families who wrote down 2 emergency contact numbers on a piece of paper and stuck it to the inside of a cabinet, not because they were afraid, but because it took 2 minutes and it costs nothing. Preparedness is not a personality type. It is not a lifestyle. It is a set of decisions made in advance so that when the moment arrives, and the data suggests it will arrive for most American households at some point in the next decade, you are not making them for the first time in the dark. The 24-hour blackout is not a survival scenario. It is a stress test for the decisions you made before it started. And every hour of that test reveals something you either thought about ahead of time or did not. If you have been watching this and mentally going through your own home, checking it against these windows, these failure modes, these quiet degradations, then you already understand something that most people learn only after the fact. The goal was never to frighten you. The goal was to give you a map of the next 24 hours before you need it, because maps are only useful when you can read them before you are lost. The next question that follows naturally from all of this is one that almost nobody thinks to ask until they are standing in front of their pantry during hour 14 of a blackout, trying to figure out what they can actually eat when the refrigerator is off limits. And the stove depends on the same grid that just failed them.
Staying prepared is key.
What you keep in your pantry,
these pantry shelves hold
and just as importantly,
for the next few
how
weeks.
you keep it and in what order you reach for it,
I saw them outside the window.
turns out to matter enormously.
They knew we were here.
And that is exactly where we are going next.